The workshop is going to last an hour and a half. And our facilitator is Dr. Samuel Oluwafemi Oyamaki. Is Dr. Oyamaki in the room, please? Okay. Welcome. It's good to see you. Dr. Samuel Oluwafemi Oyamaki holds bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in statistics from the University of Ibadan. That's the oldest university in Nigeria. Well, that's debatable. He is a fellow, graduate statistician, chartered statistician, and a chartered scientist of the Royal Statistical Society, United Kingdom. He is also a member of the Nigeria Statistical Association, Professional Statistician Association of Nigeria, International Biometric Society, Nigeria Mathematical Society, and International Statistical Institute, ISI, among others. Dr. Oyamaki is also a statistics educator interested in understanding how statistical concepts are best communicated. He is currently the master's degree coordinator and a lecturer in the Department of Statistics, University of Ibadan, his alma mater, with passion for teaching and conducting research in statistics utilization, modeling, and practice. Please put your hands together as we welcome Dr. Oyamaki. Would you like to come up? I think you're better off here. Okay. The session ends at 4:30, please. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, okay. I want to be sure that we are together. I stand here representing the working group on modeling and intelligence of GET. And I represent Dr. Angela Chukwu, who is the head of the working group that is involved with modeling and intelligence. Today, my assignment is a bit simple and could be a bit difficult. As I've been told to introduce you to mathematical modeling of infectious diseases. I guess I assured the moderator that I will not take much of your time. Next slide, please. I'll try to go through this outline, some of which I believe we are familiar with. Okay, some of which I believe we are familiar with. Method of math and computer epidemiology, classification of infectious diseases, basic definitions, general approach to modeling, mathematical models of infectious diseases. And I will simply just take these 3 or 4 basic models that we know are currently in existence. Infectious disease remain a leading cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide, with HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria estimated to cause 10% of all deaths each year. And the outbreak of Ebola, as mentioned by Professor Kinyabayomi the other time, led to unprecedented numbers of deaths and cases. The new pathogens continue to emerge in animal and human population, as demonstrated by the emergence of SARS in 2003 and of highly pathogenic avian influenza in poultry and human in 2004-2005. I believe this 1-hour intensive course should introduce you to the concept of infectious disease modeling in human or vet, and emphasis will be on developing the conceptual understanding of the basic methods and their practical applications. Science, as we know, works by building a model, and not just a little card model, but model made out of symbols. We believe that the concept of modeling, is the same in all fields, but it becomes difficult modeling a situation or modeling a concept or process which you don't understand. So it means before you can model a particular process, you should be conversant to some extent, the processes. Okay, we get an understanding of things we care about, which is much deeper than we could ever get if we stuck to words and picture. And that's why I say mathematical models do not replace words and picture. They simply just sharpen them. So the concept of model here deepens our understanding of systems, whether we're talking about a mechanism. Or before I go back to that, when I refer to the concept of words and pictures, this brings me back to the picture, a layout picture that Professor Abayomi showed us the last time, where we had a layout diagram of when a patient comes in, this low probability side, high probability side. He was able to discuss that using some pictorial concepts. And this is the process through which models are also based. I said understanding infectious system requires being able to reason about highly complex biological system, and with hundreds of demography and epidemiological variables. So intuition alone is not sufficient to understand the dynamics of such system. Now, in trying to experiment, we often, prohibitively expensive and unethical and do not always lead to fundamental understanding. I give an expression here, which I say E equals to M squared. Okay? E here represents a concept that we believe that these two concepts can actually produce E. So the beauty of this concept is that if measuring E or having a record of E, or a documentation of E, if it is a difficult concept, then if you have information about M and C squared, having established that these two concepts determines E, it might be very, very easy for you to produce E. Well, to some that are in malaria studies, I believe the process through which they obtain T-half is always very, very, very difficult for them. But looking forward to, the concept of PRL-D1, PRL-D2 has successfully been able to assist them in determining, this concept of T-half. So this is just to illustrate how the model that I'm talking about, how they operate, how they work. Mathematical models have become important tool in analyzing the spread and control of infectious disease, especially when combined with powerful modern computer method for analyzing and simulating the models. I put a picture here saying what can math model do for us, okay? And if you look at this picture very well, you see a man that is trying to assemble something, all right? And what is he trying to do? Say, what can math model do for us? It can sharpen our understanding of fundamental processes. It can be useful for us to compare alternative policies and interventions. It can also help us to make, decisions, prepare responsive to bioterrorist attack, provide a guide for training exercises and scenario development. It can also help us to guide risk assessment and, as mentioned the other time, predict future trends through early detection. In order for maths and computer science to become more effectively utilized, we need to make better use of existing tools. I also said here that in order for maths and the computer science I'm talking about to be more effectively utilized, we need to develop new tools. And in doing this, we need to establish working partnership between mathematical scientists and biological scientists. And I think this is the basis of the multidisciplinary research, okay? We need to start talking together. We need to start introducing, the two communities to each other, so that we have a known problem, an identified problem, using the same, language and tools. Also, we need to introduce our standing junior researchers from both sides to the issues, problem, and challenges of mathematical and computer epidemiology. We need to involve biological and mathematical scientists together to define the agenda and develop the tools of this field. And these are the fundamental goals of this special focus. Math's model of infectious disease go back to Daniel Bernoulli's mathematical analysis of smallpox in 1760. Bernoulli is a probability specialist. He's a statistician and a mathematician. And there is no student that would have graduated in the statistics profession today that wouldn't have been introduced to Bernoulli. And some of the things he was able to do, are concepts like the core populations in STDs. He has this kind of chart using his model, to determine early syphilis cases in Oregon, 1980 to 1996. He has also been able to make explicit concepts such as herd immunity for vaccination policies, which has led to insight about drug resistance, rate of spread of infection, epidemic trends, effects of different kinds of treatments. Then the scientific computation that involve mathematical modeling, analysis, and numerics involve the process the flowchart that I described here. The first thing is we have the real system. All right? We have a real system. It is from the real system that we can perform our experiments. Of course, we can generate our experimental results. The model we need to make here must be a model that describes the real system. And that's why I said when I was starting up that you cannot model process or system that you don't understand. Okay? Now, if we make a model, the model system, if it is adequate enough, if it is good enough to describe this system, can be used to perform simulations. Okay? And of course, the simulation results can be used to compare, can be used for comparison so that the model can be improved based on the experimental results that we have generated from the real system. Okay? This can also be used to compare and improve theory. Of course, most statistical distributions, tends to, to follow the normal distribution. And when we say normal distribution, we discover that when we look at data, most of the data we have to work with, they don't exhibit this pattern. So it means that the result from our simulation can also help, in improving the theory for us to have a better model that we describe the real system. We have types of model. Model can be static and it could be dynamic. A dynamic model accounts for time-dependent changes in the state of the system, while a static model calculates system quantities, assuming that it does not change in time, and thus it is time invariant. So a dynamic model typically employs the use of differential equations or difference equation, which will be the subject matter for today's discussion. We also have the discrete and continuous model. Okay? The continuous ones incorporate time and systems and system state as continuous, while the deterministic and stochastic is one in which every set of variable state is uniquely determined by the parameters in the model and the initial state of the variable. So the stochastic, most of the time, what we have presently in the epidemiological discipline had the deterministic model. But recent work that we do now are now, studying the possibility of having a stochastic model because of the qualities of randomness and probability distributions. There are some key terms that are very important in this concept. One is susceptible, and that is uninfected but able to become infected if exposed. We have the infectious, infected and able to transmit the infection to other susceptible individuals. We also have the immune, that is possessing cell-mediated or humoral antibodies protection against an infection. When Prof was saying using the blood of a recovered patient, as an alternative, or infusing the blood of a recovered patient on a sick one, These are some of the things that actually establish immunity. Now we have disease clinical infection. That implies the presence of clinical signs of pathology, but not synonymous with infected. Then we have the latent infection, subclinical infection, which implies presence of infectious agents, but absence of clinical diseases. Then we have a carrier, which implies a protracted infected state with shedding of the infectious agent. And carriers may be deceased, recovering, or healthy. I put in this chart to show the relationship of some important time period. And if you look at this chart very well, the patient at the bottom, is infected first and transmit the infection to the second patient. So each person has its own latent period and incubation period until they become infectious. We also have epidemic, the occurrence in a community or region of cases of an illness clearly in excess of normal expectancy. We have an outbreak, which is an epidemic limited to localized increase in the incidence of a disease. Endemic, the constant presence of a disease or infectious agents within a given geographic area or population group. Then we have pandemic, which is an endemic occurring over a very wide area, crossing international boundary, and usually affecting a large number of people. The general approach to modeling, as shown in the diagram that I will be showing next, requires translation of biological scenario into a mathematical problem. This is very, very important. The process typically begins with a clear description of the purpose based on the scientist's understanding of the system. And the translation, and this is translated into mathematical equations that can be made with, that we have a specific goal or biological questions that the researcher has in mind. Then the verbal description of the system is encoded in mathematical equations. The model should incorporate only those features that are relevant to the specific goal or biological questions in mind. So once the model is formulated, then we can investigate it. We can test it. We can drive the model. We can simulate it. And we can test for the adequacies of the model. Now, we have a biological questions and we have experiments and data. Of course, we have biological interpretation. Now, the biological question will give us, will be used to develop a mathematical model. And the model developed will be fitted to data. The parameter of that model will be estimated. And of course, the model can be used for simulations and sensitivity analysis. Okay, the mathematical model can also be, taken forward to mathematical analysis for us to obtain what we call the expected outcomes, which still comes back to what we can use for simulation and sensitivity analysis. It may be analyzed to produce critical quantities that govern the overall behavior of solution and may be fitted to available data or used to simulate experiments that can produce data. Most of the time, especially in infectious disease like this, we always have paucity of data. Okay? It's either the data are not in the correct form or they are not available. And that is why the concept of this simulation is of great importance, especially when we have models that have been tested to describe the situation. Mathematical models usually consist of parameters and variables that are connected by relationship. And variables are abstractions of the system property that can be quantified or measured. Most of the time, researchers have expected, have interest in some specific variable. But before it can be processed, you have to be able to understand whether the variable you have in your mind or your mind is quantifiable and how you intend to measure it. Because it is very, very important that you know how they can be measured. Of course, model can be linear and non-linear. Okay? A model is classified as non-linear if it contains a non-linear dependence on the variable. An example could be a product of variable. Otherwise, it's classified as linear. When we say linear, linear is when you say the relationship between A and B, okay, move towards a straight line, okay? It could be that as one increases, the other one increases, or as one increases, the other one decreases. But the relationship must give some form of a straight line. But if the relationship is otherwise, then it's going to be non-linear. It can exhibit, it can be curvilinear, it can even be polynomial in nature, okay? It depends on the curve or the relationship that exists between the variables of interest. Like I said before, Bernoulli formulated model for smallpox in 1760. Hammer in 1906 also formulated and analyzed discrete time model. These are people that have worked, on some of these areas that we're discussing today. Ross developed differential equations for malaria as a host vector, okay? And that's earning him a Nobel Prize, in medicine. We have the Carmack and McKendrick, 1926, who extended Ross model and obtained the epidemic threshold result. The mathematical models of infectious disease can be classified based on the compartments, okay? Because we call them compartmental models, based on the compartment as which we are looking at it. The first one is what we call the SI model, okay? And like I said here, SI is successible infectious model, all right? And it is applicable to HIV. You have the compartment for susceptible, and you have that of the infected, all right? The relationship is such that your recruitment into this category from here is determined by this function, okay? Where the R that we have here is the number of contacts per unit time. And B is the probability of disease transmission per contact. Okay, I is infectious human. And we also have N, that is the total population size, which is simply the addition of the susceptible and infected. Of course, if you look at this, from this expression that N equals to S plus I, it means that S itself will be N minus I. So when you remove the infected from N, you have the susceptible. And if you take this forward to here, what I have simply done here is that the S that we have here, under this, now what we have done here, so that because I know all of us are not within the mathematical field, what we have done is to look at the change in susceptible with respect to time, okay, and change in the infected with respect to time. And this is what makes them dynamic model. So looking at this, we have been able to formulate it into some basic differential equation, which we can now solve to obtain what we call the solution. All right. Now, if you look at, like I said, RBS 1 over N is is the result that we have looking at the change in infected with respect to time. So if you look at that, and like I said the other time, that S can be interpreted to be what? To be N minus I. Okay? N being S plus I. So we have this representation which can be solved. All we need to do here is just to separate variable, okay, and solve to obtain this solution. The solution we have here actually presents something that is very close to logistic relationship, logistic growth curve. And that is why I said, like, we have the equilibrium point. This is infected at disease-free equilibrium. We always set it to 0. And infected at endemic equilibrium, we always set it at N. Because what we are saying is that if it is endemic, it means the entire population is infected. All right? But if we are looking at equilibrium, we are looking at the time at which the infected has vanished or is vanishing from the population. So looking at this, if we plot the graph, you can see the curve. This is how a logistic growth curve will look like. Like I said here, we have the transmission parameters. And under the transmission parameter, I said, RB being the number of contact per unit time multiplied by the probability of disease, because here we have also said how is the number of contact per unit, and probability of disease transmission per contact is better. So when we multiply, so we have this, and that is how we have RB, which is now the number of contact per unit time multiplied by the probability of disease transmission per contact. They are combined into one parameter, often also called beta, the number of adequate contact per unit time. So for disease where a contact is well defined, okay, it is usually more appropriate to separate the contact rate, R, and the probability of transmission per contact, beta. So, but for diseases where contacts are not well defined, such as airborne diseases like influenza, it is usually more appropriate to combine the two into one parameter. The compartmental model, like I'm talking about, we also have the SIS model. You know, the first one we discussed was the SI model, susceptible, infected. The other one is the susceptible, infected, susceptible. So it means that from this compartment, you can be infected, and when you are in this compartment and then you come back to susceptible. Okay? Then we also have the SIR, which Prof has represented with the diagram. This is susceptible, infected, recovered. It can be recovered for some particular disease, and it can be removed for some particular disease, infectious disease. Okay, if it is removed, that is when it goes to mortuary, just like Professor Buyami mentioned the other time. Then we have the SEIR model, which is susceptible, exposed, infected, recover, or removed. Now, the concept here is to separate exposed from susceptible. For example, if we're looking at the case of Lassa fever, okay, it's not common in every part of Nigeria to start with, but there are some hotspots, areas where it's very, very rampant. Okay, people living around that area can be tagged to be exposed, whereby some of us that are from the far side of Nigeria may be susceptible, but we are not. And so the probability of time, the probability that we will contact or will become infected is lower compared to the probability that an exposed person will. This is actually, for example, we have some medical professionals, the caregivers, okay? Most of the time, they are always in this compartment. So now talking about the SIS model, please, moderator, when it is 15 minutes, just give me a small note so that I can round up, please. I don't want to take your time too much. All right. So the susceptible, infectious, susceptible model, okay, is applicable to the common code. We have the susceptible compartment, and we have the infected. But the rate at which you move from this susceptible to infected is determined by this, and the rate at which you recover back or you return back to susceptible is governed by this lambda. Okay? So, and if you look at what we have here, we have we're talking about you getting infected with respect to time. I'm trying to bring it down to English language so that it doesn't look too mathematical for us to follow. Okay, so the high, the T, okay, is expressed as what we have here. Of course, like I said, this is the rate at which this comes back to this. So for cases whereby the disease is endemic and is difficult to contain, you expect a small proportion of this Just like in the case of that woman that Prof showed that recovered from Ebola, you don't often find them. So, that's modeling such a situation will return a smaller version of this lambda, okay? But it has not removed it. So, we have, like I have here, you have the per capita recovery rate. So, the system can be reduced to a one-dimensional, to one dimension using this expression. What we have simply done here too is to have substituted S with n minus 1. So that we can separate the variable and use our elementary knowledge of ordinary differential equation to obtain solutions of this. Okay? And we still have that. The infected at degree disease-free equilibrium is 0, and at the endemic equilibrium to be this expression. And the curve is presented as a numerical solution of the SIS model using these parameters. So, we talk about the basic reproduction number, BRN, okay, which is often denoted as R0. Okay, and I have this diagram from the from Pan Inform 2009. If you look at the first stage here, the initial stage of epidemic, R0 is what? 3. The same R0 has grown to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay? At the next stage. So, how do we define, or what is this R0? This basic reproductive number is the number of secondary infections that one infected person would produce in a fully susceptible population through the entire duration of the infectious period. Okay? And it provides a threshold condition for the stability of the disease-free equilibrium point. Okay? The disease-free equilibrium point is locally asymptotically stable. Well, when we say locally asymptotically, it means that as we vary our t towards infinity, meaning that as we go into time, okay, as our time becomes large, okay, we believe that that condition will hold. Then when R0, which is our basic reproductive number, is less than 1, then it means that the disease is actually going into extinction. Okay? It's dying. All right? And when it is greater than 1, okay, which symbolizes that it is unstable, it means the disease establishes itself in the population or an epidemic, occurs. At this time, that is when we talk about when will it take that population to reduce to half of its current size. Okay, because we already know that the disease thrives. So meaning that more people will die. So this kind of interpretation has brought about, timely interventions and, solutions to ensure that this is given priorities. So for a given model, if R0 is fixed over all time, the deviation is only valid for simple homogeneous autonomous model and can define similar threshold for more complicated model that include heterogeneity and or seasonality, but the basic definition no longer holds. So this one is simply saying that the way we interpret this when we are talking about Nigeria is different from the way we interpret it when we are talking about Africa. Okay? Now we have different set of people. Okay? It's no longer homogeneous. Okay? It's now heterogeneous. So the specification of the basic reproduction number should also follow suit. And we say R0. I decided to put this in this form so that it will be clear to all of us. It can be expressed as a product of 3 quantity under the SIS. And we have it as number of contact per unit time multiplied by the probability of transmission per contact multiplied by the duration of infection. And for the SIS model, this is what we have. Okay? R times beta times 1 over gamma. Okay? With that, we can obtain the basic reproductive number for under the SIS. Now, evaluating basic reproduction number under at equilibrium. Now, what we do here is to multiply the basic reproduction number by what? By the susceptible and the total number of population over time. And that is expressed here. Because what we have here is that if you look at, we have ST. What we have here is ST over NT. So meaning that R naught here is simply just R B over gamma. All right. So if this is done, we will have been able to obtain R T. Now, on that, still talking on the basic reproductive number, how quickly does it spread? Okay, you look at MERS, is just one person infects half person, almost half, 0.7. But you look at this, Ebola infects 1.7. Okay, then we have smallpox, one person infects 7. Measles, 1 to what? 17. So this is just to further explain how important this basic reproduction number is. Okay, we have the SIR epidemic model. Here we have S compartment S to high to R. From S to high, we look at transmission. Then from high to R, we look at recovery. Okay. Now the compartment, individual susceptible to the disease, infections, infected individual able to transmit. Okay, the parasite to others. Then we have the recovered. Individual that have recovered becomes immune or have died from the disease and do not contribute to the transmission of the disease. So this is specified as this. S is the ST, high T, I is the high T, R is the high T, and N itself equals to the addition of this compartment. So it means that if we want to know the total number of people that are in the population, it's simply the number here plus the number here plus the number here. Okay? It gives us the total number of people in the population. And if that is the case, then, well, like I said, that this is applicable to measles, mumps, and rubella. We have, this becomes the rate at which people in this compartment are recruited into this. And people in this compartment are recruited into this based on at this rate. All right. Of course, if we draw this diagram further, we can have an extension here, here, here. I mean a line, because somebody can be insusceptible and die naturally. So we always classify that as mu. All right. Since the death is not as a result of the disease, so we draw them down, but for the purpose of just taking us through so that we can follow. That's why I left that out here. All right? So the basic differential equation were also formed from this compartment to have the change in S with respect to T, change in I with respect to T, and change in R with respect to T. Okay? Where R is talking about the recovered humans. The transmission assumption is that beta is the average of the average number of adequate contacts. That is, contacts sufficient for transmission of a person per unit. And the BI over N is the average number of contacts with infective per unit time of one susceptible. Then we have the number of new cases per unit time due to the S. Okay? This is often called a horizontal incident. Then the recovery assumption is such that a fraction alpha of infective leave the infective class in unit time. There is no entry or departure from the population except possibly through death from the disease. Okay? So this is strictly that we are closing. It's just like we are assuming a closed population here. We expect that the next migration is 0. New people are not coming into the population. Nobody is leaving. So we assume a closed population. So, and that is what how that is saying. This is represented in the diagram here. So we now have rate at which persons from in S are recruited into high, being beta, and rates at which person in high are recruited into R, being alpha, such that we can have a reduced form of our expression in the differential form. The parameters of the models are, thank you. Okay, the transmission rate, the recovery or the removal rate. So the basic SIR deterministic epidemic model numerical simulation also gave this. Okay, with initial values this. We're able to produce this. And if you look at this, you can see that the R is on the increase. Okay? The susceptible is decline. And the infected, rose here and also declines. So model predicts that there is an epidemic here. But when we look at, these are just examples to illustrate what I'm saying. Here we assume R0 to be 3. There is another case where we assume R0 to be 0.75. In this situation, here, like I said the other time, that when R0 is greater than 1, means you have an unstable situation, and that's endemic. Okay? And when we have less than 1, it means that the disease is actually dying off. All right? So, and that is what we have presented here. Now, we can also reduce to 2 dimensions by ignoring the equation for R and using R equals to n minus S minus 1. Actually, the reason for doing this is that we can look at the population differently. Okay? Look at the dynamics of the disease itself, of the host differently, and look at that of the disease itself. But the context of the one-dimensional concept is such that we reduce the source of variation to 1. And that's why we've been substituting S to be n minus I. Okay? So we don't have to integrate or obtain solutions for S differently for n. So in finite number of equilibrium points with I star equals to 0, then we perform a portrait analysis. Then we can now estimate final epidemic size. So the R0 for the SIR model, like I said before, is given as this, RB over gamma, where we have R to be number of contacts per unit time, probability of transmission for beta, and duration of infection, for as 1 minus 1 divided by gamma. Then this is the graph that is shown before. Now, what we have simply done is, like when I talked about simulation the other time, since we have a model, we can vary the parameters and see the impact it has on the curve. Okay? What percentage of intervention do we need to ensure that this disease dies off? Okay? Or how do we ensure that we have quite a number of recovered persons from this on these issues of infectious disease things? So these are what we have done. That's why we call it numerical solutions of SIS. We simply just assume values for the parameter to see the impact on the graphs. Then of course, we need to include human demographics for disease where the time frame of the disease dynamic is comparable to that of human demography. And there are many ways we can model this. One is constant immigration rate. The second one is constant per capita birth and death rate, density-dependent death rate, and the disease-induced death rate. I think I've discussed this before. This is just to give us the infected under the disease-free equilibrium is also set to 0. R under the disease-free equilibrium is also set to 0. And the S under the disease-free equilibrium is set to this expression. Okay? Where that mu, like I said the other time, is just the death that is not due to the infection. All right? So this can be used to perform stability analysis for the equilibrium point and draw phase portraits. These are just the numerical solution varying the parameters. And the condition for an epidemic, as I've said before, when our change in I with respect to T is greater than 0, okay, we tag that to mean epidemic occurs. And when it is less than 0, then we expect that the disease is actually dying off. Let me not bother you with this theorem, but this is a theorem, talking about the solution of the SR model. Now, the other one I said, the additional assumption that I left out the other time under the SR model, we have bats, because now we are now introducing the concept of birth and death. the susceptible population that we have, people are still giving birth. And each birth recorded is also coming into that compartment S. Okay? And of course, those in this compartment can also die as a result of anything. It can be as a result of any sickness that is not due to that disease that we are studying. And then from the infected compartment, we know these are the set of people that are already infected. But if there is another death on any of the members in that compartment that is not due to the infection, then that is also taken care of as death. Okay? Then we have recovered. From those that recovered, it is possible that they also die. Because the life of a man starts from birth to death. So these are some of the reality that we are brought into this compartment for them to mimic the real life situation. So finally, I talk about the HCIR model. The HCIR model is expressed here, successfully exposed infectious recovered model, applicable to measles, mumps, rubella, etc. So we believe that we have that. The rate at which the population, their fertility rate, the rate at which they produce new persons is captured by this symbol. Of course, all those newbies, they are also recruited into the susceptible class. And of course, we are used to this. This is the rate at which people in this compartment are recruited into expose. Then we have mu to make up for death, natural death that is just due to chance. Okay, if somebody is already HIV positive and is in a cohort you are studying, and you just suddenly you were informed by the researcher that he's been hit by an Okada man and is dead. Okay, so all those rates are taken as mu because the death is not as a result of the disease. And their differential formulation is also given as displayed here, where our N, which is the total population, is S plus E plus I plus R. And the basic reproductive number is computed using this. Number of contacts per unit time multiplied by the probability of transmission per contact, duration of infection, probability of surviving exposed stage, and if that R naught is less than 1, then the disease-free equilibrium point is globally asymptotically stable. Okay? And there is no endemic equilibrium point. So it means that the disease is actually going into extinction. Okay? And it's otherwise, if it's greater than 1, it means that the disease, exists. So this is just a two-species disease and population. I only gave a slide on this, where I said it's possible for us to have different populations. Disease model with birth and growth included are designed to determine long-time dynamics of population of hosts with a common disease. All right? Where each one are separated, we have S1, we have S2. For example, you are looking at issue of Lassa fever. Then you have the population of humans. You also have the population of the mouse. Okay? And looking at this situation, then, of course, we have two different growth functions. And that is the concept we have described here. These are some of the extensions to compartmental model that we have identified. Compartmental, it assumes homogeneous population, divide the population into different groups based on infection status and the like. And the limitation of this model, okay, is that the two classic model presented assume that the total population size remain constant. Okay, they assume that the population is uniform and homogeneously mixing. Mixing depends on many factors, including age, and it also ignores the concept of random effect, which can be very important when S or I are small. Okay, so these are some of my references. Thank you for listening.
And he did great with time, didn't he? Please put your hands together one more time. Dr. Yamaki, thank you for reminding me the reason I was never a science student. I could never understand or imagine how you bring letters or figures and have them interact. But thank you for your contribution to knowledge, for the research, for the great work that you are doing. Because, like I said before, you want to keep us healthy, keep us safe. And then with all this, what will I call them now? These discoveries or these your figures interacting and ensuring that we are able to detect, we are able to know who's doing this or that. Please let's put our hands together one more time for him. I'm very good at other things, but this one, no way. So, you're good. You're great. So, do we have questions for him? Aha. Good for you. Professor Bayomi has raised his hand. See, every table, which means you've done a fantastic job. Okay, so let's have the show of hands one more time. Okay, Professor Bayomi on this table, 2 on this table. Where else? Okay, 2. Okay. But before we take the questions, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Alan Christophels, the chairman, Conference Organizing Committee. We missed you in the morning, but we were so expectant. We knew that you would arrive very soon and that you will come and enrich the conference, as always. Thank you so much. So we'll start with Professor Bayomi. Who's moving the mic around? Where did she go? Okay, thank you. And then you can respond to all of them at the same time.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions for you. I was following your modeling mathematics fairly all right up until a point. And I was imagining to myself that it could get very complicated if you start to include things like resistance profiles and patients who have been infected before, who are in the population but no longer susceptible, and people who are not infected, have no immunity but have some genetic resistance to a particular disease, like we know happens in HIV and other kinds of. So just a perspective from you in terms of how complicated it can get when you start to introduce these confounding factors and variables which would completely put a new spin, because I felt it was a bit simplistic in that your population is either susceptible or infected, and those two add up to the sum total of it. But in a real life scenario, it's not as simplistic as that. Then the second question I have is, and I think you mentioned or you were alluding to it towards the end, since we're talking about climate change and opportunities for emerging infectious diseases, do you have models that sort of look at the changing environmental variables, which then either, well, in this case, accelerate the zoonotic events, in other words, the transmission from entities in the ecosystem to the human population? And if you do, have you started to apply those kind of climatic changes to being able to predict when a Lassa event is going to happen, or when an Ebola event is going to happen, or when a pandemic flu event is going to happen? And if not, are you planning to? And that is certainly something that we're interested in hearing about.
Okay, and so thanks a lot for your presentation, and I could clearly sense from your presentation that in your first few slides you made the point that for us to model these systems, we actually require some understanding of the biological process. And so are you then indirectly saying that what we're desperately needing on the African continent is to produce and understand more and more of the diseases that we are faced with, so that we can improve our chances of how we can predict either outcomes or how we can predict when new when new diseases will arise. And so if I could summarize that, I'm just trying to ask you, do you think that are we doing enough from your experience in terms of how we are collecting data so that we can actually take advantage of these very robust models which you have presented to us?
Thank you very much. When I entered, I was pressed. I wanted to go to the loo, but when I started listening to your discussion as an epidemiologist, I couldn't go out. So it was quite a tutorial for me. Actually, sometimes in the past, I've spoken with Professor Abayomi during the 2016 when Lagos State hosted talking about this issue of mathematical modeling, looking at the population of Lagos State and the risk of, having quite a number of communicable diseases coming up. There was an area in your discussion where you're talking about prediction of occurrences leading to early detection. So that aspect, I want you to explain more about it. How could we, on the field, use that to actually support our work so that we'll not be at just responding? It will be a kind of preparedness for us. We could give us insight into how to prepare for eventualities and even how to prevent the occurrences of those diseases. Sometimes ago we still have collaboration with Instra Global Health Solution, and when they came, they talk about historical modeling. Like they collected information from us of about 10 years disease occurrences in the state using the IDSR model. And through that, they were able to come up with information to predict from what we have in the past to now tell us that this is what we expect in the future. You did not talk about that here. Then I also want to ask, in the ISIR model, we're talking of susceptible, the infectious, and the recovery. You didn't talk about carriers. How do we predict? No carriers, they are harboring the infectious agent. They do not develop the disease, but they can spread it to other people. Cholera is an example. Typhoid is an example. And quite a lot of bacterial infection. So how do those ones come into this mathematical modeling scheme?
I was really very fascinated when I was listening to your presentation. And when I looked at the modeling, SIR modeling, which is susceptible, infected, recovered, or removed. The recovered are not likely to contribute to infection, particularly for that infectious agent that they have recovered from. Rather, their plasma can be used
for the treatment of those that are being infected. But you mentioned that the removed are not likely to contribute to the transmission of infection, particularly for that agent of infection. But there are a lot of instances in which I presumed that the removed can contribute to infection. For instance, in Lassa, the dead body of a Lassa patient is even more highly infectious than the one who is infected. Now, can we deduce or derive a mathematical modeling for the removed that are now a potent body for spreading the infection within the community? Thank you.
Okay, are we done with all the questions? Okay, I will start with Prof's question. On the issue of resistance profile, whether it's genetic or environmental, these are components that can also be looked into. And like I said, what I have tried to do today is to present the basic of how our understanding of the dynamics can be represented mathematically. But as this has been said now, and that is why I said, see, there is no mathematician or statistician that will single-handedly conclude a study on infectious disease. It's not done. If such person exists, then that paper or that article will not go far. Because you have to work with scientists that are into that field. Like what Prof just said now, okay, it is also possible. All I need to know is that exists. Then I look at rate at which we have, I quantify the number of people that we have within the population that have developed resistance, or based on some literature, what scientists have found out, or the proportion that scientists have found out to be resistant to the profile, whether it is genetic or environmental. The proportion is what will help us in the modeling. And that is why within the working group, we're trying to harmonize idea and see how we can take it forward. Then on the population not susceptible or not infected, this does not happen for all cases. In some instances, like the one Prof shared with us, like the case of a recovered person, is the blood of such person being used as a form of cure for okay, that we have. That is why we don't have just a dynamics. We don't have a representation for a case. No, we don't. In such a situation, we must make up for such possibility. We must make up for them. So when we make up for them, it means that the susceptible, that is why we use dash. Okay? After recovered, we dash those one out. Okay? There will be a line that we go, but it's not going into any compartment. Some model, I have seen such models, in the context of this mathematical modeling. Recovered, we just have a dash. It's not going to anywhere. Okay? It's not returning back to susceptible because we believe that it's immune. It cannot be infected again. So such persons are used to reduce the success, not to reduce. Anyway, they are taken away extremely from the population. Okay? Since they are no longer susceptible and they cannot be infected or become infectious. And on the area of modeling changes in environmental variables, well, I've been part of a T21 climatic modeling for Nigeria. It was done here in Abuja by UNDP. And that is when we discovered that the concept of climate modeling is actually, it's within about, it's like an intersection. It's like a union between three active sectors with different subunits. Okay? Because population has a way our people, because of hunger, that's the reason why they have encroached into the forest. And that is why the forest is getting depleted on a daily basis. Well, I think there was a solution then, and it has been piloted in Cross River State, and that is the concept of RED+. I'm not sure, maybe a lot of us are aware. Of course, afforestation project failed, because if you harvest a tree today that is 100 years, and you have planted 15 in place of it, are you going to wait for another 100 years to harvest another one? So, afforestation project failed. So, in a way to mitigate some of these challenges, the concept of RED+ came. Okay? And the essence is that for the amount of carbon that your reserved forest can trap, okay, you are paid for it. So, it means that you are paid for retaining your forest, instead of you selling all those trees to loggers and the likes. So I think this is an initiative that will have corrected a lot of depletion going on. Then the concept of environmental variable. You see, in genetics, I teach statistical genetics to our graduate student in UI. And I know that some are recessive, some are dominant. Okay? And some carriers, just like you mentioned, some carriers that seems not to be infectious can be triggered by some environmental factor and make them to be infectious. They can become, of course, they are carrier, they can infect people. The concept is that they are not infected. Okay? And they are not supposed to be part of susceptible, because they simply infect, they cannot be infected. So if we have a case of, if you have a study that we are looking at such situation, and we have some of these carriers in our population, that is a way we can make up for that in our representation. You know, the beauty of this is, you know, with due respect to the moderator that said thank God she wasn't a scientist, you know, is that the representation is very, very easy. Okay? Fine. The aspect of the differential formulation could pose some difficulty. But immediately we know that this compartment exists. Okay? All we need to know is how much, what is the rate at which this carrier infects the susceptible. So immediately we know that we can have a representation, and we can, you know, pull out the differential formulation that we can now solve to obtain solution. So that is about that. Then yes, so I guess I have answered your question one way or the other. You know, you see, a statistician does not know it all. A mathematician does not know it all. Unfortunately, our system is such that we want to work alone. Okay? But there are studies where we cannot work alone. All right? I didn't study medicine. I studied statistics all my life. Okay? But the concept of problem identification, okay, from a basic algorithm to flow charting, can go a long way in making me to understand your problem. Then that problem can now be formulated using mathematical concepts. Of course, we have to also agree, okay, before we can go forward. Because you are the scientist. You are the one that are there in the field. You are the one that knows how these things work, okay? Mine is to just ask you some questions, and the modeling concept can start. On data issues, I think the problem we have now is no longer data, because now the whole world is talking about big data. I'm aware that at URF, which is Research Foundation in UI, there have been some move to have some sentinel centers at the airport where we can profile new diseases and things like that. So I wouldn't know how far that has been done. But if these are generated, information like this can be taken forward, and we can have, you know, prediction. Okay? CDC in the US always have this red flag. Okay? When, you know, and I don't think we've been having that in Nigeria. Okay? I don't know about other parts of Africa. You know, that red flag that this disease is likely to, you know. But one thing that this our mathematical model can also do is this. Even though we have identified that a particular disease is going into extinction, we can also compute the probability of its reoccurrence. When will it take it to reoccur? Okay? So when we know how far or how soon it will occur, it can also help in developing intervention to mitigating them. So that is that on the issue of data. Yes, I think I've answered the issue of prediction, which you raised. Imagine new diseases, then historical modeling. Well, when you talk about historical modeling, well, I don't know much about it, but it sounds to me like something that has roots in genetics. Okay? When we start profiling a particular disease to know, to identify what we call the most recent common ancestor, and look down the ladder to identify, whether there is a particular history, okay, that a particular family, maintained over time. Okay, some of them could be complete, they could exhibit complete penetrance, while some will not be complete. So some of these things can also be modeled. Okay, the SR. Okay, I've talked about the carriers. Okay, yes, the issue of recovered, not successful, and removed being infectious. Well, since I've had that now, we can look at a situation, a scenario where that can be done. And like I said, there is nothing, if we can think it, we can work it out. All we need to do is think it. Because the essence is that the essence of this is we want a model that will address, that will show a better sensitivity to real life situation, not something that is just not describing what is happening. So if it can happen, if we can think it, then we can sit down. And that is why the concept of discovery starts from thinking. Okay? The idea can be put down and we can work it out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for providing clarity, responding to all the questions. And for me, the questions actually brought your presentation to life, because the questions were not around letters and figures and, they were just about real life situations. How does your work enable the practitioners to be proactive in terms of preventing the occurrences of AIDS or improving the levels of preparedness for responding to outbreaks? And I think that this is in line with one of the objectives of this conference, looking at how do we collaborate, how do people come from different areas and come together to say, how do we figure this out? So you are a statistician and then working with scientists to, solve problems that are plaguing us. So I think that's a very, very good one. Mathematical modeling, I've learned a lot. I'm sure that the next time I'm going to be engaging you, you'll be surprised. So, any other questions? Any observation? Okay, in the absence of any questions, observations, I would like to say a big thank you to Dr. Oyamaki for the very illuminating presentation. And then I would like to ask all of you to please put your hands together for him. Okay. So, are we still good? Are we ready for the final part of today's meeting? Are we ready? Okay. We are going to have 4 presentations. There will be 4 abstracts to be presented by the following. Professor Morenike Upong is moderating. She's chairing this session. So I would like to invite her to this table on my left. before I bring the presenters to her. Please put your hands together for Professor Mo. So I have 5 names for 4 presentations. That table, that one, no, the one there, please. Yes, so that all of them can sit with you. So I'm inviting Kwabina Owusu. Is he or she in the room? Okay, please make yourself comfortable. Dr. David Ishola. Okay. Dr. Mustafa Kolo. Okay. And Megan Barry, as well as Benjamin Goebel, who will be making a joint presentation. Please put your hands together for all of them. You didn't show any excitement when I was calling them out. It's not fair. Please make some noise for them. Okay, so Professor Upong, the show is yours. Please introduce the speakers.
All right, okay, perfect. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for staying on to this hour. Welcome, Alan. Nice to see you here. So we have 4 presentations. They have 10 minutes to present, and we have 10 minutes for you to ask questions from each person. Hopefully we'll be able to save another 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the session where we can take 1 or 2 extra questions before we close for the day. We will be starting with Benjamin and Megan's presentation. They both work with Global Health Divisions, Chemonix International, and I'll hand over to them. Yeah. You're going to need this, I guess.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Ben Goebel. I work in the Global Health Division at Chemonix International. I'll be presenting with my colleague Megan as well. So just to give you a quick preview of what Chemonix is, so you know where we're coming from. We work at Chemonix, which is an international development company headquartered in DC. But our company works in over 70 countries around the world. And we take a multi-sectoral approach to international development. So we work across the development space, but have a lot of work in supply chain and global health as well. So today we wanted to talk about that multi-sectoral approach and how that applies to global health security. And we're going to share a couple of practical examples of work that Chemonix has done in this area and a few key lessons learned along the way. Go to the next slide. Great. So consistent with Chemonix's multi-sectoral approach, today we're going to talk about that, how that applies to global health security. And we all know that effective implementation of the global health security agenda requires coordination across a huge variety of stakeholders and sectors. There's a huge level of coordination that's needed for an effective preparedness and effective response. So a couple of areas where we've put this into action through our USAID funded programming is supply chain and human resources for health. And today we're going to share a couple of specific tools and approaches we've developed that countries can use to practically integrate into their health systems to be better prepared to deal with potential outbreaks. You can go to the next slide. Great. So first we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about some of our, an approach we've developed for emergency supply chain frameworks, and this was developed on the USAID Global Health Supply Chain Technical Assistance Project. And this was really developed to help countries assess and prepare where they're at with supply chain capacity with a lens of global health security improvement. Okay, so first let's start with talking about what we know about supply chains. Supply chains are obviously important. They bring the global health commodities and treatment essentials to people who need them. But globally, public health supply chains face a huge number of challenges, whether it's supply chain fragmentation, governance and leadership gaps, a low capacity of staff, inadequate supply of commodities in the first place, and a lack of data that allows leaders to make informed decisions. And so when those supply chains are weak, we know that citizens in those countries are vulnerable to outbreaks and don't have access to the treatment that they need. So we believe that establishing a system to manage supply chains ahead of emergencies is essential to making sure that the commodities are at the point of care where people need them to be. And we hope that health systems can be prepared to do this as efficiently as possible. And we're going to talk, Megan's going to share now about a tool that we've developed for countries to assess and prepare their supply chains for emergencies.
Thank you, Ben. So yeah, as Ben mentioned, this was developed with a project with Chemonics International, funded by USAID, the Global Health Supply Chain Technical Assistance Francophone Task Order, which is a bit of a mouthful. And this was in response to Global Health Security Agenda and USAID priorities. And it was, Chemonics worked with McKinsey and company to develop and pilot this framework in Cameroon. In Cameroon, was that? Oh. Sorry, I forgot that word. Okay, so Cameroon was identified as a phase 1 priority country, which is why it was selected, along with the fact that they exhibited readiness to implement and develop this framework. And so the goals of this USAID framework, as Ben said, was to kind of tackle some of these supply chain challenges. And the framework itself, the outcome or the goals of this framework were to build the capacity of countries to properly manage their supply of essential commodities. And then not only that, to effectively and efficiently supply these commodities during a disease outbreak. And this framework itself consists of 3 components. The first being a best practices report, and this report was essentially a literature review of best practices, case studies, and interviews from supply chain and infectious disease experts from around the world. It was reviewed and validated by the WHO and UNICEF, and it was published as the best practices in supply chain preparedness for public health emergencies. And this report served as the foundation for the next component, which is the Emergency Supply Chain Playbook. And this playbook is essentially a tool set of standard operating procedures, protocols, and templates for emergency response actions. And so a general playbook was developed from this best practices report, and then the general playbook is taken by countries and adapted to specific in-country contexts, which is what you see below the country-specific customized playbook. And then finally, the third component is a simulation exercise, and this is essentially implementation and testing of the emergency supply chain playbook in country. And this allows public health and supply chain stakeholders to simulate a disease scenario, to practice decision making during an emergency, as the emergency unfolds, to understand best practices in communication and coordination, to understand the different types of disease outbreaks, and test the efficacy of the playbook itself. And during these simulation exercises, it's when gaps in the playbook are identified. And so the final step is essentially identifying those gaps and then reassessing the playbook and improving upon it so that it's ready to go in its full form. So the framework itself takes a One Health approach and focuses on emergencies caused by diseases with human, environmental, and animal factors. And here you'll see the essentially the timeline of the implementation of the framework. And as I mentioned, this was implemented first in Cameroon, so this is what it looked like in Cameroon. And it begins with the kickoff meeting for stakeholders to explain the GHSA activity, to secure buy-in, to schedule future working groups, and achieve consensus on the proposed One Health approach in country. And partners or stakeholders during this kickoff meeting include government departments, development partners, and international and local NGOs that are currently working in country and typically provide support during an emergency response. And then the other actor you'll see up here is the emergency supply chain lead and the team itself. And these are comprised of officers from the Ministries of Health, Agriculture, and Wildlife in country. And so after this one-day kickoff meeting, then the process to customize the general playbook to in-country context begins. And that's here where you'll see these different working groups to discuss people and processes and the collaboration and communication protocols, the commodity planning, and the transportation and logistics. And this process takes about 2 to 3 months. And then it culminates with the simulation exercise, which is typically 2 days. And then at the very bottom, you'll see this maintain and refresh, and this is a critical component to the framework. Obviously, like, things change within country, and the playbook itself needs to be continually revisited, and it's an iterative process to continually update it to make sure it's really like in its best form to respond or to be utilized when an outbreak occurs. And so as I mentioned, this was implemented in Cameroon, and this was in March through May of 2018, and it's since been implemented in Kenya and Liberia as well, and it's currently underway in Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso. So as you know, we have limited time, so I'm just going to go through this part really quickly, but this is essentially the emergency supply chain playbook toolset. And so it's composed of a management checklist, which is essentially a wall poster for the ESC lead to visualize and track the completion of preparedness deliverables. And then we have the Esc Preparedness Overview, and this is just for senior leaders. There's the technical user guide, and this is essentially step-by-step implementation guide and tools for the ESC core team. Then we have the response job aids, and we'll take a look at an example of one of those in a minute. And these are essentially like a crash course on disease overviews and the supply chain considerations and response protocols. And then finally, the response quick guide, which summarizes response protocols when an outbreak occurs. And very quickly, this was published, the framework itself was published and is publicly available on GHSA's website, and we have a link to that at the end of this presentation if you want to take a look at any of this more in depth. So this is an example of a supply chain job aid. We chose Lassa fever as we thought it would be an appropriate example. And so, as I mentioned, this helps emergency supply chain managers prepare the supply chain at the outset of a disease outbreak. And it includes a checklist of suggested commodities for each disease, the emergency supply chain protocols, and the contact information. And this is used by all levels of the emergency supply chain staff during an emergency response. And so what have we learned from the implementation in Cameroon, Kenya, and Liberia thus far? We've learned that it's critical to ensure the buy-in and support from the government and all relevant ministries and other stakeholders, and involvement of the One Health ministries is absolutely critical. We've learned that it's critical for ESC leads to be identified from the outset and be trained. And again, this is an iterative process, so it's not just one training. It's throughout the year, just so everyone is prepared and ready. And again, like responding to differences or changes in country contexts and regulations. Coordination between international partners and host country governments must be ongoing and consistent. And it's important that the ESC framework is aligned and integrated with the existing national emergency system. And this is recognizing that every country already has an emergency system in place. And so this framework needs to be adapted and integrated with that existing, not just put in place of it or just operating outside of it. And then a multi-year sustainability plan, holding training events, and revising the playbook as necessary. Again, recognizing that this is an iterative process that constantly needs updating. So I've talked about the supply chain component of an emergency response, and so I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Ben to talk about the human resources component.
Great. So we'll just go quickly through just touching on a simulation approach that's been used to prepare human resources in a few different countries by Chemonics and on some of our USAID work. So this is on the Human Resources for Health in 2030 project, which is funded by USAID and implemented by Chemonics. So just generally, the One Health activity that we're implementing is focused on preparing primarily at the national level to promote and improve global health security. So we're providing technical assistance within a variety of ministries through embedded advisors and planning and strategy work. Right now working in Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. But one of the tools that we use to test and evaluate and prepare the people that actually work in health systems are simulations. So we've done a number of disease-specific simulations. So the first example is from May 2019, which was a tabletop simulation with the government of Ethiopia. It was facilitated by the HRH 2030 project in conjunction with the Ohio State University College of Veterinary Medicine and focused on highly pathogenic avian influenza. So this was a tabletop simulation. It wasn't a full-scale field simulation. It was just getting people in a room working through some of the challenges they would face in an actual outbreak. And there's a variety of lessons learned that we took from this exercise that we think apply to a number of different contexts. First, that in line with the One Health approach, is vital to standardize terminology when you have people from different sectors, or especially both the animal health and the public health sectors. It's important to make sure we're all using the same terminology so we can work together easily. And then one thing that we've seen in both our supply chain work and in our HRH work is that communication and coordination are key, and it's important to know who's in charge of what, and so it's important to have specific agencies taking the lead on specific tasks. Another recent example was the Rift Valley fever outbreak field simulation, which was on the Kenya-Tanzania border. This was held in conjunction with a large number of partners. And this was a full-scale field simulation in a number of different locations. I think the most salient part of it was that it was on an international border, so there were a lot of lessons learned from that. Most importantly, that in a multi-country response, there's a variety of different ministry structures that may be in play across borders, and so staff need to be prepared and flexible to work across different response structures as they're working with their counterparts on the other side of a border. So going along with that, language barriers as well can be a significant barrier to effective coordination, and is something that needs to be addressed early on. And then lastly, one of the hardest things to prepare for is the level of uncertainty that would be present in any outbreak. And so trying to work real world levels of uncertainty into training and preparation materials is something that is difficult to do, but can be very helpful for those that are attending trainings. So these are just a couple of the activities that Chemonics has implemented, and we think the lessons learned are can be applied in a variety of different contexts and different outbreak scenarios. And so we hope that these are tools and resources and guides that can be used pragmatically and adapted to different countries and used and integrated into existing health systems. So, and the link on the bottom there has all of the tools and management checklists that Megan was going through. So if you'd like to take a look at any of them, they're all available, publicly available there. Thank you.
I was told that we'll take all the questions at the end, so the presenters will have 15 minutes each for their presentation. So please join us. All right, so we'll take the next presentation. And that's from Dr. Mustafa Adam Kolo, okay, who's the senior lecturer with the Department of Geography, University of Maiduguri, Borno State. He's a medical geographer with interest in geographies of health and epidemiology. So we'll be listening to him, and then we'll take the next presentation also.
10 minutes?
You have
Yes, I will finish in 10 minutes, inshallah. Okay, good afternoon all. When we saw the call for this conference, we became committed to attend. And this is a practical, empirical research from our faculty, the social sciences. It is a research we undertook in Maiduguri. And we know the key issues there, the issue of insurgency, economy, Lake Chad Basin, and the changing climate. Okay, can we continue, please? Okay, sir. For the benefit of all, this is the Lake Chad Basin, and you can see how wide it is, and is the area we're going to talk about. Of course, it's the largest basin in Africa, and the center of the Lake Chad Basin is the Lake Chad itself, and there is a lot of ethical diversity in that particular region, and then a population of about 30 million people, and then diverse rivers and water bodies. The drivers of conflict in the Lake Chad Basin. Actually, these are the 4 key issues we identified. The issue of conflict with non-state armed groups. In our abstract, we submitted Boko Haram, but there's a broader dimension to that. It's not only Boko Haram. We identified there are other groups in that region that are creating conflict. And then the issue of extreme poverty. There's underdevelopment in the region. And then the changing climate. All this actually has triggered the displacement of population in the area. As of February 2019, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria hosted over 4 million people, either as internally displaced persons within the Nigerian boundary or as refugees in Cameroon, Niger, and Chad republics. And then we just came across a study, it's a very current one, 2019, from a Berlin-based think tank, the Adelpi, and this is, I'm quoting from them. They said the Lake Chad is not shrinking, but climate is fueling terror groups. In the 70s and 80s, what we observed is the total square kilometer of about 25,000. And then that shrunk to about 2,000 square kilometers in the 90s. And then since then, according to the report, the lake is growing in size and is relatively stable. Climate change and the Lake Chad Basin. Because of the very high social mobility in that region, of course over generations, and then also the issue of problem of governance at all levels. And then the other factor, of course, again, is the climate change, have worsened and have created the climate problem in the region. And then this is the beginning of the crisis period in the lecture basin, especially in the northeast, if we are talking about Nigeria. Specifically on 27th July 2009, the whole region was plunged into the problem we are experiencing today. Now, this is the beginning of conclusion of this presentation. Epidemic 1, mass killing, which we have seen in the mass media or social media, execution of Islamic scholars or religious leaders in general, and then the recruitment of youth into the insurgency process. Epidemic 2, that gave rise to a number of IDP populations, especially those that migrated to Adamawa, Borno, Bauchi, Gombe, Yobe, and of course other parts of the country. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we had refugees in Chad, Niger, and Cameroon republics up to now. And this is a small social science research which we use some of the students in the department to do a rapid assessment research in about 9 IDP camps and some portions of host communities within Maiduguri. We specifically looked at the IDPs who live in the IDP camps and then in the host communities. And we found a very disturbing results. 79% of the IDPs are housed in IDP camps with very poor facilities. We have talked about the cholera, the tuberculosis incidences which we are going to see later. You can see that over 54% lacked food, shelter. And then the period of displacement we were very critical about, 5 years, 7 years. So most of these IDPs have been displaced for over 7 years, living in IDP camps and in host communities. And you can see that only 37% reported they have successfully integrated into their host communities. Because a very large family size. Over 36% of those that were interviewed reported they have 12 or more people because of the high level of dependency, children whose parents have been killed by the insurgents. And then the issue of education also is very serious. 50%, half of those interviewed, only went to informal schools. So very high illiteracy level. And then the level of employment also. That's a big cause of this big social problem in the society, especially in Maiduguri and other big cities in the northeast. And Maiduguri is most affected. Majority of them are not employed. And then these 3 local governments, because they have high population, of course, Goza, Bama, and Kukawa. We have heard of the Baga story. Baga is in Kukawa. Okay. So over 50% of the IDPs are from these 3 local governments, residing either in host communities or IDP camps within Maiduguri. And then epidemic 5. We ran a small CBO, and this is a grant we got from Token Trust England and under the Action Aid Nigeria, and we were able to go to the IDP camps to do some relief distribution of food items. So a very large population in the IDP camps, a lot of congestion. Most of them we can see are women and children. And then epidemic 6, this is the second to the last slide, I think. This is a presentation we just made during the National Tuberculosis Conference hosted by the Stop TB Nigeria. I'm happy since from the keynote speakers, Professor Aboyemi, to the Director General, NCDC to NADI, they have extensively used geographical tool, the map, to display health information, and that is where we geographers are now coming into the issue of health. We are not clinicians, but we employ geographical tools to display health information. And this is a particular one. It's a small research we also conducted. We got data from the Borno State Leprosy and Tuberculosis Program. It's a 4-year data for number of TB cases reported in IDP camps. And we decided to display it on this map of Borno State. You can see the incidences are very high in Goza, to my right, Goza, Bama, Diukwangala, and then to the border, to the Niger Republic, we have Mabar local government. We can see the problem displayed there. Thank you very much, Shukran.
So please keep your questions, and thanks for really keeping within time. So I will be calling Dr. Kwabena Owusu, who's currently a research fellow with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and has been with the school for the past 3.5 years. Prior to that, he was working as a clinical research monitor with a number of clinical research projects in the UK and Africa. He will be presenting about the safety and immunogenicity of 2-dose vaccines with AD26 and MVABN, Philo. All right. In a phase 3 trial in Sierra Leone, phase 3 I'm excited about. So yes, we have 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity given to me this afternoon to present the work that we have so far done regarding Ebola prophylactic vaccine in Sierra Leone. And I must say some of the key notes that have already been given is more or less going to make my speech quite straightforward, because a lot has been talked about Ebola vaccine and the various outbreaks that has happened from 2014 to 2016, and also the ongoing outbreak in DRC. So our vaccine basically is 2-dose monovalent vaccine, and it's a prophylactic vaccine that we are evaluating safety and immunogenicity of adenovirus serotype 26, Ebola virus, that's a monovalent vaccine, and second dose also given between 56 days interval. So we are giving the first dose AD26, and the second dose we are giving modified Vaccinia Ankara, Bavarian Nordic multivalent filovirus. So these are the 2 vaccines that we are currently using. I must say this data is for the adult phase. So some days or weeks to come, when the other data for the children are ready, we shall also present in the opportunity, when we get opportunity in such conferences. Am I using the correct one? Okay, all right. So I would like to acknowledge my co-authors for the great work they have supported in bringing this work to this level. All right. So as I earlier said, this vaccine has been sponsored by Janssen Vaccines and Prevention, which is the pharmaceutical arm of Johnson & Johnson that most people are very much aware. So as I previously mentioned, this is a non-replicating viral vector that is given as a prophylactic vaccine in a 2-dose way. So the first dose is given with the at 26, and the second dose is given with MVA between the period of 56 days. There has been several trials that have gone on in Europe, US, and Africa at various phases, ranging from phases 1 up to phase 3, with more than 6,500 participants enrolled, ranging from children up to adult phase. Currently, there are ongoing arrangements also to continue the phase 2 and phase 3 studies, starting in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Uganda. So, objectives of our study. As we have all been aware, the outbreak in 2014 to 2016 really highlighted the need for safe and effective Ebola vaccine. So our vaccine was to evaluate the safety of a heterologous 2-dose regimen, utilizing the R26 Zibok and MVA BN Philo that is given at 56-day interval. So the secondary objectives also to assess humoral immune responses for the vaccine measured by ELISA at 21 days, those 2 vaccination, and also to assess safety and tolerability using a booster vaccination dose using the at-26 Zibok vaccine. That is also given at least 2 years post-dose 1 vaccination. So where are we? We are in Sierra Leone, Cambia, so that's a very small portion indicated by the green arrow. That's where the study took place. So the study design was in the stage phase. So the stage 1 was open label study that enrolled a total of 43 participants. So all the participants received the Ebola vaccine, where at 26 is given as dose 1. Then after 56 days, the MVA is given as dose 2. So total of 43 participants were enrolled for the stage 1 phase. For the stage 2, we enrolled a total of 400 adults, and that was a randomized controlled double-blind study. So some participants were randomized into the treatment arm, whilst others were randomized into the control arm, and the ratio was 3:1 to that effect. So you can see there that there are children that have also been enrolled in the same stage 2 manner, but this data is only for the adults, so I will leave the one for the children now. So the participant demographics, as earlier indicated, we can see that we had a very few number of female participants in the stage 1. Out of the 43, we had only 1 female participant, but we can see that as we moved to the stage 2, the number was quite appreciable. So what did we do? As we saw from the objectives, the study aim was to assess for safety and immunogenicity. So we made sure that every participant that was recruited and received each of the doses is followed up. So we follow up for safety, and the safety we have to ensure that we collected the local safety solicited AEs as well as systemic solicited AEs. So these are some of the AEs we collected and listed there: the pain, erythema, swelling, and itching. And these are the most commonly solicited AEs that are being sought for in most vaccine trials. So this, after the participants have received each of the doses, they are followed for 7 days, where the field workers will go to the house with the diary cards and solicit for this information. And on the 8th day, the participants come to the clinic and being evaluated by a physician. And for the unsolicited AEs, these were collected up to 28 days post each of the vaccination. That's the dose 1 and the dose 2. For serious adverse events, they were collected until end of study. And we also collected some neurological events that happened in other studies. So we also collected them, but so far in our study, there was no immediate reportable event recorded. So for the solicited adverse event summary table, we can see from the graphs here that there was a very low frequency of grade 3 adverse events, and the most frequently observed local solicited symptom was pain at the injection site. For the systemic solicited symptoms, we can see that fatigue, muscle pain, headache constituting the most frequently observed symptom. And again, we can also see that very low frequency of grade 3 occurring for the systemic solicited events. So for the unsolicited adverse event, for each of the stage, you can see that the most frequently happen were headache and malaria and general infection that occurred. Again, we can see here as a booster dose for the vaccine, those who were in the stage 1 phase, they were given a booster dose after 2 years after the first dose. That's where we can see a booster dose there. So I'll also talk much about that when we move to the next slide. So for the SAEs, for those in the stage 1, a total of 3. Out of the 43, we had 3 recording an SAE. Then also for stage 2, those who were randomized into the Ebola arm, out of a total of 298, we had 16 that recorded a serious adverse event. Again, for those who were randomized into the control arm, out of a total of 102, we have 4 that recorded serious adverse event. And none of the serious adverse events were related to the study vaccine. In total, we had 1 death who was randomized into the treatment arm, and we can see that death occurred 7 months after receiving the second dose. That was also assessed as not related to the study vaccine. So the endpoint, at the end of the day, we want to know how the vaccine is going to generate the necessary immune responses, whether we are going to be covered. So this was done using the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, and these are some of the responder definition that was used also for the assessment. It's 2.5 times over the baseline value of lower limit of quantification. So binding antibody responses that was observed. So for the majority of subjects that had the binding body antibody responses, we saw that approximately 77 of the participants up to the 720. So for the dose 1, between 54 to 65 responders were recorded. So for those who received dose 2, that's 21 days after receiving the dose 2, we have 98% responders. And after 1 year of receiving the dose 1, we had 49 to 77% responders. So from the graph, we can see the baseline. Then we can see those within the control arm, those within the Ebola arm for stage 2, and those also within the Ebola arm for stage 1, who all of them received the Ebola vaccine. So binding body anti-responses after the booster dose. So we can see that the vaccine, after giving, at least it was still able to produce the necessary immune responses up to 2 years. So after 2 years, I've been mentioned that the stage 1 participants were given a booster dose. And when the booster dose was given, after 7 days, there was approximately 40-fold increase in immune responses when the booster dose was given. And this booster dose lasted up to 3 years until the participants exited the study. Again, we can also see that when they were given the booster dose, we're able to see a sharp increase in their immune responses. So that also gives an indication that at a very high risk zone, those who have received the 2 doses can still have the opportunity to receive the booster dose for full protection or for longevity in that manner. So in conclusion, we all saw what happened between 2014 about the Ebola epidemic. So there was a need for safe and effective Ebola vaccine to be developed to curb some of these infectious diseases. In all, the vaccine was well tolerated in all participants who were in the previously affected Ebola country, that's Sierra Leone. So the vaccine also regimen elicited a very robust Ebola virus glycoprotein specific binding antibodies in 98% of the participants at 28 days post the dose 2. And also the vaccine regimen also induces humoral immune responses that rapidly give a response within 2 years post dose 1. So as I earlier also indicated that since the vaccine was able to produce antibody responses even after 2 years, and when they were given the booster dose, it was a high rise increase in the antibody responses fold. There is also the possibility that after receiving the 2 doses, when people are at risk, there's also the possibility of receiving a third, which is the booster dose as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks for keeping to time. Okay, so we have a last presentation that's from Dr. David Ishola. Dr. Ishola is an associate prof with the Department of Clinical Research, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He's also the team lead for EBOVAC project in Gambia, Sierra Leone. He will be presenting on hypertension prevalence in volunteers of an Ebola vaccine trial in northern Sierra Leone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much. And my apologies to people on this side of the room. I think the lectern is blocking your sight, so sorry about that. I would say I'll just be following on from the slides just presented by my colleague. So those are the results from the main analysis of the study that we carried out in Gambia in Sierra Leone, the safety and immunogenicity results. For the adults. Now, still focusing on the adults, we just want to take the opportunity to also look at other data that we have been able to generate from the study. And in this case, we are focusing on the blood pressure measurements that we took in the participants in those who volunteered. As I'm going to show you, a large number of people came to volunteer, and then we took all their blood pressures, and these served as a sort of a proxy for a community survey of blood pressure in the population. And these are our co-authors. I will not go over this again, as Kwabena has already done that, only to highlight that we had about more than 800 people volunteering, of which 400 were enrolled for the study. And the data that I'm going to show is from all of these individuals who came to be screened to participate. So the study took place between 2015 and 2018. And Kwabena has already presented the safety and immunogenicity results. So this was simply to gain, this sub-analysis was to gain an insight into the hypertension prevalence in volunteers for the study. So we reviewed that data, and we used the 2018 European hypertension guidelines to classify the blood pressure, and I'm going to show that in a minute. And we used an electronic blood pressure machine to take the readings in adults who had been sitting in a resting state for at least 5 minutes. So as you can see, this is the classification of hypertension that we used. Hypertension is defined as blood pressure of at least 140 over 140 systolic and 90 diastolic. And that's very important because that varies according to the classification that you use. We should also note that even those with normal blood pressure still had different levels of classification, and that will also come up in the results shortly. So, as you can see, of the 870 volunteers who had valid results, 164, that's 18.9%, were hypertensive, of which 41 had isolated systolic hypertension. In terms of gender, 16.5% of the males were hypertensive, as compared with 27% of the females. Okay, all right. So, yeah, the hypertensive proportion was 18%, and 16% of males and 27% of females. Now, so we wanted to find out how many of them, of these hypertensive people, already knew that they had high blood pressure before we checked them. Only 22 of the 164, so only 13% of those individuals were previously known to be hypertensive, of which only 8 were on treatment as at the time of the screening. So it really shows us how only a very, very small percent, only about less than 5% of the hypertensives were on treatment. As a further risk factor for overall cardiovascular assessment, about a third of the hypertensives were also found to be either overweight or obese. So by age, we see here a very clear and statistically significant overall trend whereby the prevalence of hypertension rose with increasing age, from about 5% in the young adults aged 18 to 29 years to about 80% of those aged 60 or above. In terms of the severity of hypertension, graded 1, 2, or 3, according to either the systolic or the diastolic blood pressure, according to the European guidelines that I showed earlier, we see here that the majority, about 62%, were of grade 1 severity, 18% grade 2, and 19% grade 3. So we see here that about 40% of the hypertensives were either grade 2 or grade 3. So moderate to severe hypertension in a very significant proportion of the hypertensives. Also, as expected, the severity increased with age, such that in those who were below 40 years, most of them had grade 1 or grade 2 hypertension, whereas in those aged 40 years or above, the majority had either grade 2 or grade 3 hypertension. Now, to take a quick look at those without hypertension. All right, so these were people who had blood pressure of less than 140 systolic or less than 90 diastolic. But even within this group, the message here is that the absence of hypertension does not mean that everything is well. Because even within this category, we say, well, according to the European classifications, you can classify people into optimal, normal, or high normal BP. And we see here that a substantial proportion, about 35%, so about a third, have high normal BP. About a third have what we classify as normal BP, while only about 31% of those who were not hypertensive actually had optimal BP in terms of completely minimal risk to their cardiovascular health. Now, the limitations of the study, one was that the overall cardiovascular risk profile was not assessed. So we did not have an opportunity to check on other risk factors such as smoking status, socioeconomic status, blood cholesterol level, nutritional information, and so on. Because this was primarily a vaccine trial. So this was only extra information that we were deriving from the trial. There's also always a possibility of a white coat hypertension, even though the fact that this was, not really a hospital, but rather a research clinic. Hopefully, that helped in terms of reducing any possibility or any likelihood of white coat hypertension. Also, because this was designed not as a classical community survey, this was based on people volunteering to come forward for the trial. It's difficult to say exactly how representative of the community the data that we have is. And also, this data is from a largely rural or semi-urban setting in the north of Sierra Leone. So it doesn't give the whole picture of hypertension. We would expect that in a city that the prevalence may well be significantly higher. Now, just to think about this as a context, we see that this shows clearly that hypertension is a clear danger. The prevalence is significant, awareness is low, and treatment levels are very low. Not only is it a problem now, it's also predictably a problem for the future, because we know that urbanization is increasing in many parts of Africa. There's an epidemiological transition in progress, whereas the risk factors for cardiovascular disease are likely to become more and more prevalent with time. And there's an increasingly complex environment, with co-risk and co-morbidity scenarios. We talk about emerging infections. Many of these emerging infections, such as Lassa, Ebola, we know are contributing to increases in cardiovascular risk, and also conditions such as climate change leading to so many extra problems. So we can predict that this is going to be an increasing problem going forward. Professor Abayomi showed at the beginning of the day a graph showing how the population is going to shoot up. Population of Africa is going to shoot up exponentially over the next few decades, meaning that we have to prepare ourselves for an overwhelming burden of cardiovascular disease in the years forward. And so just to begin to conclude, the big question here is actually what is hypertension? Because we have defined hypertension here. Oh, thank you. So we have defined hypertension here as in accordance with the European guidelines. There are a number of other guidelines that we could have used. We could have used a very popular American one, the JNC classification, for example, which sets different levels for the definition of hypertension. For example, 130/80. If we were to use 130/80 as the cutoff point, then obviously the prevalence will be even higher. Now, what's important here is that hypertension is defined according to risk. So so you say hypertension starts at the level of BP that research evidence shows has a low level of risk for cardiovascular events. So the question is that, well, this is not yet well defined in sub-Saharan Africa. So maybe we are overestimating, maybe we are underestimating, we are not sure, because we don't have enough evidence for the actual levels of risk at each level of blood pressure in Africa. So this is something for us to reflect on. And therefore, what are the future considerations for research going forward? We should be looking at doing robust reviews of the literature. There are a lot of little studies here and there across Africa which look at prevalence, which look at various aspects, and it will be good to do comprehensive reviews to pull this together and get some, if you like, homegrown evidence base for the hypertension definition and classification. So we need to define the risk better, and then we need to move on to intervention studies so that we can have locally relevant and evidence-based practice and policy guidelines for the management of hypertension. And if we can go a step further than that, we can even begin to look at mechanistic studies to look at the very complex interactions between genes, environments, and the various factors locally that can be a contributor. So, in conclusion, in this economically disadvantaged setting, in a rural setting in the north of Sierra Leone, a place where you would not really expect a high cardiovascular disease burden, what our findings suggest is that about 1 in 5 adults are hypertensive, and almost all of them are unaware. So, in addition, of those not hypertensive, about a third had high normal blood pressure, which means that they are also potentially at a tipping point to go actually into the hypertensive category. So putting this together, it shows that we have quite a significant but largely silent, largely undetected threat of non-communicable disease. So our conclusion is that there's a need in Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to begin to also seriously consider the issues around non-communicable disease. Obviously, quite rightly, there's a lot of focus on infections, but I think we should begin to look at taking advantage of all the investments in infection research to also look at non-communicable disease and to plan to do studies that will cover both aspects at the same time. Thank you very much for your attention. So I must mention, before we lose funding, these are our funders and our partners, and also this snapshot of a very large team that we have up in the bush in Cambia in Sierra Leone. So if any of you is visiting Sierra Leone, please don't just stop in the city in Freetown. Take a minute and come up to Cambia to see us. Thank you very much.
Thanks for keeping to time. Thank you. So we'll thanks, Dr. Shila. You could just take your seat. So we'll ask the other speakers to please come up, and then we'll take the first round of questions for all the speakers. And that should, if it doesn't take us to the close of the session, we'll be able to take another round of questions. Thank you very much. Great. All right, if you would like to ask questions, you could please indicate with the show of hands. So that's number 1. Number 2, any others? Oh, number 3 and number 4. Yeah, and then I have questions. So we'll take from number 1. He's here.
Thank you very much. I'll start with Cambia. For the questions, I'm assuming that you had an ethical responsibility to do something about the for the people who were diagnosed with hypertension. So what did you do with those people who were diagnosed with hypertension in Cambia? And I was sitting from this side, so I didn't see the numbers for when they were presenting the main part of the study. But when I looked at your numbers, I could see from there were only several hundreds. But that the previous speaker described this study as a large phase 3 trial. How large was that? And you also showed for the Ebola trial part. Okay, still for the Ebola trial part. Yeah, the vaccine trial. For the vaccine trial. Yeah. But they also, I'm not sure what those high values of antibodies represent. What is the correlate of protection? Do we know what are they protective? Those values showing those antibodies, what do they mean?
Thank you very much to all the presenters for these very interesting presentations. I have many questions. My name is Dr. Olivier Manegard. I'm from GFA Group, based at the West African Health Organization, Bobo Dioulasso, Burkina Faso. My first question is to the Chemonix gang. I would like to know, I'm still a bit confused. I understand that your main focus is on supply chain and that you're doing simulations, and you presented like simulations on 3 main pathogens, Lassa, flu, and Rift Valley. And do you plan to cover any type of potential outbreak? That seems a lot. And if you're doing this, do you plan to supply regions and consumable, or are you only providing tools for the countries to be ready? If providing, supplying, for instance, regions, it might be difficult because of the regions for some pathogens are still homemade. So could you please elaborate a bit the way you plan to actually put this into practice? My second question goes to the London School team as a whole, I think, because you will probably remember the STEP family trial for HIV where adenovirus type 5 was used as a vector and increased the risk for population to acquire HIV. So I'm wondering if with adenovirus 26 you have also the plan to investigate the susceptibility of increasing the risk for acquiring HIV for these populations, because this might become a problem for in the future if you plan to vaccinate with this vaccine, for instance, a population in Zambia, which is close to RDC. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have some that are just comments and some that are questions. My question is for the two of you. The first thing is, you didn't tell us how many participants, that you used in the study and how the doses were applied. Okay? Yes. Sorry, I'm not good with names. Yes. I want to know how the doses were applied, maybe the design of the application of the doses. Then you mentioned mean response. Why mean response? Why not median? Why not median response? When you were reporting your conclusion, you talked about mean. We know from literature that mean is sensitive to outliers, and it may not be a good basis. You may not assess such a study using mean only. So I think median should also be looked at. Then the two doses that you studied, are they equipotent? Sorry. If they are equipotent, did you do any biological assay to establish credible interval? So that is what I have. Then for the hypertension stuff, One, you have answered, because we know from literature that BP, rises with age. So you've been able to do that. But I guess you should have done some basic test of association, looking at BP statuses to all these, how do you call them now? The known risk, no, not really the side effects. Something like headache, like that you noticed. The essence is to look at, whether this BP you are talking about is actually, related, with this stuff. Then hypertension is likely to increase over time. You said that. I guess that statement is outside the scope of your study. Because I was to ask you, is this study a longitudinal study? If it is not a longitudinal study, then it will be very dangerous to say that it increases over time, since you didn't observe the subject over time. Yes, I think I'm good.
Okay. I think my question goes to the presenter on Lake Chad. If I got you right, you said the Lake Chad shrunk for some time and later it started correcting itself. That in the last 10 to 20 years is no more shrinking, if I got you right. Now, the question is, the factors that contributed to its shrinking over some time, are those factors no more there in the last 10 to 20 years? That's for you. Then for the vaccine trials, you mentioned that the participants were followed up for about 7 days, if I got you right, Dr. Ofo. So I want to know what informed your decision in following up for just 1 week and not for 3 weeks. Why did you decide to follow up for 1 week for adverse events following the administration of those, the vaccine? Thank you.
First presenters? Yeah.
Thanks for your question. I think it was 2 parts. And the first one, if I understood it correctly, was we gave an example of Lassa fever. Are there tools to address other outbreaks, and how are we working with countries? So the job aid I showed was just one example of many. There are job aids for Ebola, avian flu. So it's a whole tool set. And then to address the second part of that, how are we working with countries? And so the main objective of this project, or this the framework, was to develop a tool set for countries, recognizing that there was a lack of readiness and preparedness for countries during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And so trying to address that gap and creating a set of tools that any country could essentially use and adapt to their country context, really taking a comprehensive look of all of the pieces of the puzzle that need to come together for a country to really effectively and efficiently address and respond to an outbreak. And so that includes the collaboration, the communication between all the different ministries and stakeholders that need to take place, and then all of the health commodities, which includes both the medicines for the patients, but also all the personal protective equipment that the healthcare workers need, and making sure that there's a ready supply of that in country. And then once the outbreak occurs, how that's all provided and where it needs to go, and looking at the supply chain within the country and how that can all be dispersed. So does that answer? That was the main objective. And then once the framework is established in country, then it's up to the ministries and the different partners in country to maintain that. Does that answer your question for the first part? Yes, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. And then I think your other part was, in the procurement, are we procuring the health commodities for the countries? Was that the other part of it? Are we procuring the health commodities for the countries? So, as I mentioned, the main task to address the global health supply are the technical assistance part of this. It was development of the framework. And then there is another project, the Global Health Supply Chain Procurement and Supply Management, that also works within some of these countries that have implemented this framework. And it's really up to the countries themselves and what priorities they've placed on acquiring these resources. So the answer is yes, we have worked with countries, but through a different project, and so that's kind of a different component. It's not really the primary function or objective of the development of the emergency supply chain framework. Obviously a critical component of it, but not part of this funding from USAID. There's another pot of funding that the procurement and supply management project works to procure the PPE and the pharmaceuticals and all of that type of thing. So, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Okay. Thank you. That is the joy of attending conferences. You see, from the practical point of view, not reports or such issues. From the practical point of view, we see maps of the Lake Chad sometimes that has shrunk and is no longer even within the body of Nigeria. And that is not true. Sometimes we see pictures of the Lake Chad being depicted as if there is no water on the Nigerian side of the border. And I think about 17 years ago, we took students to New Marte in the Chad Basin Development Project area. And from Kirinoa, there is a canal. And we entered boat and we went for 27 kilometers on the canal, which is part of the Lake Chad. So that has completely turned around the pictures we see that the lake has shrunk and is no longer on the Nigerian border. This report is very recent, 2019. What I think I must do is to go back and recheck again how do they get their data. And then the issue of whether the issues that led to the shrinking of Lake Chad, is there any reversal? Actually, there is very little reversal along that line. But still they are right in this report. So I think we need to go back and validate that one also. Thank you. Yes.
All right, thank you very much for all the questions. So I'm going to address the questions on hypertension first. One of the questions was about the fact that it's not a longitudinal study, which is absolutely right. It is cross-sectional. It's the blood pressure taken at the time that people were being screened to find out if they were healthy to take part in the trial. So this was a trial of healthy participants. So a number of checks, physical examination, laboratory tests, and actually later in the conference, I'm also going to show something about some of the laboratory tests that we did at the beginning. It's only if people did not have high blood pressure that could not be controlled that they were then entered into the study, that they were eligible to be entered into the study. That goes on also too. So you are right. So saying that the risk is likely to increase over time is simply going by what we know about the risk factors for hypertension. For example, we know that with increasing urbanization, changes in increased sedentary lifestyle, increase in smoking, all the things that happen with increasing urbanization, with epidemiological transition. Other studies have shown that all those things likely will lead to increase in cardiovascular risk. And we know that in Africa, all these things are likely to happen over time. Therefore, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we think that the burden of hypertension will increase. But more studies will be done to obviously to check whether that will happen or not. But more importantly, it's an opportunity for us haven't, just like modeling, if there's a prediction that potentially a problem could arise, we shouldn't wait for that. We should take measures now to try to prevent it if possible. Then with regard to what we did, yes, that is absolutely right. Obviously, if we are checking for something, then we need to be prepared to also assist the individuals. So what happened was that we provided treatment for the people that we found to have high blood pressure. For those of them who were not eligible for the study, we treated them for the immediate period and then referred them to the hospital system. And we not just gave them a letter to go, but actually gave them transport, made sure that they were registered at the hospital and that they were booked in to be followed up. Now, for those who were controlled, because the study protocol allowed that if people had hypertension but they were controlled, then they could participate. For those who were controlled within the first few weeks, we entered them into the study and provided them with treatment for the hypertension throughout their participation, some for 2 years, some for 3 years. That raises the question of what happens after the trial. So, I mean, that's a question for all of us, I think, because if people are in a study, obviously the project has a responsibility for them, but at the end of the study, it's not possible for any project to continue indefinitely when such conditions are not due to the study product. It's a different thing if there's something found that happens after the trial has started and is shown to be due to the study product, then that's a different matter entirely. All right. So I think in terms of hypertension, I hope I have dealt with the questions. Quickly moving on to the vaccine study. I don't know, sir, if it is possible to just quickly take a look at one of our slides which addressed some of the questions. There was a question about the sample size. We showed that very clearly. We screened almost 900 people. We enrolled 400 people into the study, of which 298 had the active vaccine, and about 100. Okay, it's the other one, so we need to go a lot back. Yeah, okay, if you go back a little bit, I think we'll see it here also, way back. Near the beginning, yeah, near the beginning. Okay, yes, yeah, back. Thank you. Back, more. Okay, more. We seem to be. Keep. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. So here I think we see clearly the numbers screened for the adults. 874 screened. 401 were included in the study. So that's the size of the study. Right. And okay. So there was a question about the mean. Well, actually, okay, again, that would be the other one. But I wanted to show you because titers are dilutions, the data is presented on a log scale. Therefore, what we showed are geometric mean titers, not just simple mean. So it's a very, very skewed data. This is a standard for vaccine studies. This is the standard way for antibody data because it's in dilutions. So actually, the risk of that is that the graph grossly underestimates the scale of the response because it may not seem to be very high, but actually it's multiple times because it's on a log scale. So that's pretty standard. I don't know if I've missed anything. The follow-up, okay, follow-up for 7 days. Okay. All right. Well, correlates of protection. Well, I mean, this is for Ebola is still an open question, as it is for many vaccines that have been used for many years. So it remains a question, and research is ongoing, and that is the case also for many vaccines that have been used for many years. Efficacy has been shown, but discussion and debate continues on exactly what is BCG and so on. Exactly what is it that is leading to the effect? So for Ebola, in our study, of course, we only looked at immunogenicity based on findings from animal studies, the binding antibody, and what we know also about viruses, about immune response to viruses. The binding antibody is what we anticipate would help to generate protection. That is why this study, we cannot talk about efficacy. All we can talk about is immunogenicity. And then we anticipate that this would lead to protection when actual exposure to the virus takes place. And this has been, and I believe we have a colleague from Janssen here. So this has been decided, this particular assay has been decided after extensive consultation among multiple partners, including the WHO, the FDA, all the regulators, because the data is going to be submitted for licensure. So there's been a very rigorous process to select what is believed to be, at this point in time, the best possible assay to check for immunogenicity. Oh, for 7. Do you want to?
Yeah, okay. So for the follow-up, as I already indicated, this is a phase 3 study. So there have been several phases of study that have taken place prior to this. So for this up to 7 days, that's where we actively follow this participant, go to their house and check for all those solicited symptoms. That doesn't end there. They have also various scheduled visits. So in detail, we cannot read all because of the time, but after 29 days, they have visit to come to the clinic. Then before they come, 56 days for the dose 2. After receiving a dose 2, 21 days, they have to come back again. So during this period, if there's any safety issue or concern, their participants are attended to as well.
Just very quickly, in addition to the scheduled visits, which continued up to the 2 to 3 year time point, so we kept following them up. The 7 days was daily, going to their houses and checking. In addition, we had a system of 24/7 physician rota. So every moment in time, there was a study doctor with a phone, with a free phone number, if possible. I mean, there are different networks. Some networks have a free phone, some don't. So we made provision for the main 2 networks in the country, whereby a doctor was always at the end of the line, weekends, holidays, Christmas Day, throughout, whereby participants could call, and the project procured an ambulance specifically for the study. To make sure that we could reach out to participants if need be, so that we could bring them in. As Kwabena mentioned, this study actually covered from age 1 to adults. What we have shown today is only the result of the adults. So more data is coming in due course. And we have just received authorization to, hopefully very soon, we are awaiting the very final authorization, but very soon we anticipate that we will equally be able to start a study in infants. This will be a multinational study in Guinea and Sierra Leone, a small study just to look at safety mainly. But because the fact is that if and when, we hope Ebola does not come back, but if and when it does come back, I mean, if you have a family and you have a 5-year-old child and a 7-month-old, just as the question with pregnant women, so we do need to have that data. So we are cautiously taking steps to get there. People ask questions about why the study has taken this long. It took this long because we did an age de-escalation approach, whereby we started with the adults, the data was checked. When the regulators were satisfied, we then moved on to the adolescents, and then moved on to the older children, and then moved on to the young children. And now finally we are moving on to the infants. So that's the way in which it has been done. Thank you.
So we have a representative from Janssen, who are the producers of the Adeno 26. who would be responding to the question on the HIV risk with the use of Adeno 26 for the study. Dr. Kashner, yes. Identity disclosed. No secret anymore. So there's a risk, it's just a lower risk.
No, there's no risk.
Okay, no risk. Excellent. I just needed the clarification. Excellent, just the clarification. Thank you very much. This has been a very rich meeting. We intend to stay on time. We're 8 minutes to the end of the program. I would like to thank the presenters. I'm sorry I won't be able to take any extra questions. On that note, I want to say thank you. Yeah, so please you could, yes, thank you. Thanks for that presentation. Also want to thank everyone that had stayed up to this hour. It's encouraging to see still a number of people seated here at 8 minutes to 6. Just to say that the session will be starting on time tomorrow at 9 o'clock prompt. And to note that today has been a very enriching presentation where we've heard a lot. If you remember, in the welcome remark, we did note that we'll be looking at 3 key areas in terms of emerging infections, in terms of climate change and biosecurity, as well as data. Today we've heard a lot about megadata and how megadata has been used in various ways to generate information of public health significance. That includes the generation of megadata through the NICE study in Nigeria, and we're learning from NCDC how they're using that, the samples collected from that to generate more information on terms of prevalence of infectious disease data. We have also learned this afternoon about data generated from the Ebola, and we're seeing how that is also being used to generate further information for the NCDs, including hypertension that has been presented here today. We also heard about the use of those data generated from the big data sets that is important to facilitate modeling. But of course, they all come with their fallacies, but the importance is that they're generating hypotheses that is allowing us to learn things better. We've also heard also about the climate change and biosecurity, but I think for me one of the questions that the sessions have risen is how do we define climate change? For me it seems as if climate change is a terminology, a slang thrown out there. And in the context of what we're discussing, truly what is climate change? That might be something we would be looking towards defining with some clarity before the end of the day. Otherwise, I would say it's been a beautiful session, and I wish everyone a wonderful evening. See you here tomorrow, and we start off 9 on the dot tomorrow. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Just before you leave,
yeah.
Just to speak